Now, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, regularly carries out surveys on attitudes in the U.S. This was, of course, even well before the Gaza war, but they've just released a new survey of the American public looking at a number of anti-Jewish tropes. Let's just look at some of the key findings of that survey. The number of Americans who hold anti-Semitic beliefs increased to 24%. Up from 20% in 2022. More than 42% of Americans either have friends or family who dislike Jews or find it socially acceptable for a close family member to support Hamas. 27% of Americans would find it somewhat acceptable for a close family member to support Hamas. Millennials and Generation Z have surpassed older Americans and agree with more anti-Jewish tropes than any other generational cohort. And a third of respondents at least somewhat agree with the statement that Israeli operatives are manipulating U.S. national policy conspiracy theories, which are quite popular in the U.S. now. Well, joining us now for more, we have Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO and National Director of the ADL Anti-Defamation League, speaking to us from New York. Jonathan, thanks for speaking to us. I want you to go into detail on some of these, but I'm just going to mention the one that really stands out for me as worrying is the finding about the younger generation, the millennials, and we call Generation Z, that we're finding deeper or more widespread anti-Semitic feelings here, going against the trend of decades where it usually would be in the other direction, finding that in the older generation.
No, that's correct. I mean, ADL has been measuring anti-Semitic attitudes in America since the mid-1960s. I mean, we've been at this longer than anyone else, and we've never seen this phenomena where young people are more prone to anti-Jewish tropes than the older generation. I mean, usually there's a bit of an Archie Bunker effect, if you know what I mean. And so the older crowd, more stuck in their ways, will have a more prejudiced view. That's not the case here. I think there are a few reasons for that, one of which is, and again, I'm seeing the graphic, what's happening on our college campuses. This whole sort of DEI industrial complex, which puts Jews in the oppressor box, which excludes anti-Semitism from the litany of evils. That creates the conditions in which Jews, despite being the most targeted religious minority in America year after year, are somehow cast as villains. So that is bad. And I would also just point out, in a related phenomenon, is this normalization of anti-Semitism generally, and specifically anti-Zionism. And the willingness, if you will, for college presidents and other people to tolerate what would be intolerable if directed at anyone else has put us, I think, in large degree in this very difficult position.
Right, and what I found interesting in this poll, rather than just looking at more familiar or older patterns of anti-Semitism, you looked, for example, towards the acceptance of Hamas. People finding it acceptable to not Palestinian cause, but specifically of Hamas, an organization, of course, that its very manifesto is, you could say, anti-Semitic and genocidal towards Jews. And that is a worrying trend, something I think you would only really find to some degree since October 7th.
Yes, I mean, look, Hamas should be considered with Al-Qaeda or with ISIS or with Boko Haram. It is a terror organization, as you said, whose charter compels them to try to murder Jews wherever they are. That charter doesn't say anything about Palestinian self-determination, doesn't say anything about a two-state solution. It is clear with its vision of a Judenrein, Middle East, right? One where Israel is destroyed. That's what they call for, except they don't refer to it as Israel. They only refer to it as the Zionist entity. So the notion that Americans would think that somehow this is acceptable is stunning. And I think it really suggests a kind of cultural rot and a moral relativism that's going to take a long time to solve, because this is the real story. There is no silver bullet here. It is going to take time for our leaders to regain their moral compass, for institutions to enforce their own rules, for social media to clean up its act once and for all. It's going to take time to not just de-Hamasify Gaza, but to de-Hamasify some of these pockets here in the United States.
Right. And also one other, I think, interesting finding here that it lends a very contemporary spin to anti-Semitism is the finding that a third of Americans believe that Israeli operatives are manipulating American policy rather than simply accepting that there are many, Israel has many supporters among the American Jewish community, among, for example, members of the evangelical community that simply support Israel. But as your report stresses, this falls in with a conspiracy mindset that has taken hold of American politics, where there always has to be some kind of sinister force behind all events.
That's right. Like, anti-Semitism is at its heart a conspiracy theory about how the world works, that somehow centers all the evils, posits all the blame lies on the shoulders of the Jews. We as a minority lived in diaspora for thousands of years, and we were an easy target for the church or the mosque or the emperor or the caliph or the king or the pope or whatnot. Today, now in our modern era, those tropes have been adapted and sort of morphed into a set of contemporary forms of bigotry. And so in this one, the idea that Israeli operatives are manipulating the government, I mean, it's laughable, but it's not when you consider it falls into this myth that Jews somehow have power in controlling government. I mean, look, if we're controlling government, we're doing a terrible job of it, if you will. Because we're dealing with all kinds of complexity right now. The good news is that the Biden administration has been rock solid in supporting the state of Israel. The GOP has been rock solid in supporting the state of Israel. We've got to continue to make sure that that mainstream view holds and that the extremes on both ends are not allowed to somehow move further into the mainstream.